What is the Obama administration going to do about all of this? Well, let's bring in somebody to help us work through this. We're joined now by Gartenstein-Ross. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a professor in Georgetown University Security Studies program. David is also the author of Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We Are Still Losing the War on Terror. David, good to see you.
Always good to join you.
Khalifa Haftar, this general that was under Gaddafi and then was essentially a prisoner of war in Chad, then escaped the United States. Now he's back for the overthrow. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Which side of this should the U.S. government be on? Are we with the embattled government in Tripoli and their militia allies, or are we with Khalifa Haftar, the general?
That's always the eternal question, and a difficult question to answer often in this part of the world. Is X a good guy or a bad guy? Certainly the prescription that he has about Libya, or rather the diagnosis he has of Libya, is correct. He argues, number one, that Islamists are playing too big a role in society, and number two, that violent non-state actors are playing too big a role in the state. But just because he has his diagnosis right doesn't mean that the prescription is the right one. If you look at Egypt, for example, the diagnosis about the Muslim Brotherhood was right. The question, though, is, is the very restrictive policies that the military government has there, is their crackdown on protesters and the slaughter of protesters the right prescription for Egypt's ills? Likewise, those who argue that Haftar is a dangerous character point to Egypt as their example, arguing that he wants to make a similar power play.
David, this is Tara. So to further that conversation about this general, it's my understanding that there are Islamist groups that are tied to Al-Qaeda who are willing to help Ansar al-Sharia fight against this general because he seems to be trying to fight against to try to get rid of the Islamists. So does this point to a civil war possibly devolving here? Libya or Tripoli is devolving into a potential civil war?
I think it's a possibility. Now, when we talk about civil war, I don't think that we should think of Syria as our model. Syria is exceptionally bloody. You have a very well-trained military that's very vicious there, that has been killing a large number of people. But Libya had already been a country where the central government was unable to extend any writ, even in its own capital city. This is a central government that is unable to execute basic sovereign powers of government in its own capital building. You've had within the past 2 months a couple of times armed forces coming in and preventing the government from even holding meetings or holding votes in its own capital building, which shows you just how precarious the situation is. You've had multiple diplomats kidnapped or killed, as our own Ambassador Stevens, of course, was, and as a result, you have a diffusion of power. There are multiple violent non-state actors that hold a great deal of power within the country, and at this point, if you look at how this conflict is going, you have multiple sides. You have both Haftar's side, you have the parliament, which ostensibly controls mechanisms of government, although some forces within government, including the special forces, have gone over to Haftar's side. The parliament has asked militias to deploy to Tripoli in its defense. And then the jihadist groups that you mentioned have announced that they're going to fight against Haftar, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're on the side of the parliament. I hope that's not too confusing.
No, that's about what's going on.
It shows you just how precarious Libya is right now.
But I think that also illustrates some parallels to Syria. I think it's useful in this respect, Tara, to your point. I think Americans constantly think of the concept of civil war through our own experience, through the prism of the American Civil War.
There's this side and that side.
Exactly. It's binary. Two
Not
sides.
over there.
And Syria shows us how multi-sided a civil war can be, and that's what Libya so easily can devolve into as well. What I'd like to point out is all of this was somewhat knowable in 2010 and 11. And we saw, and I have said this before, I was part of these debates, some of them on television, about rash actions under the guise of humanitarian causes that rip the scab off and everything will be better. And it turned out the festering wound underneath was not.
Libya is now a failed state. We just heard David discussing just how the central government essentially doesn't work. There's a parliament. They just recently, by the way, in the past few hours, called for new elections. They'll be coming up in June, as though that will somehow deal with the problem. But, Will, the point you're making, this was the Obama administration's call. They made this call. They decided to just pull the lid off and see what happens. And what's happened is this country is coming apart at the seams. There's a tremendous amount of violence. There's active al-Qaeda groups operating inside, or at least al-Qaeda-affiliated groups operating inside of it. And this was, if anything, the one time Obama made a foreign policy choice, and they've just walked away from it. They set the fuse.
The way he said we were going to lead from behind, on top of all of that.
And to illustrate the point, too, of what their idea of this was going into, it's one thing to argue maybe that if you think we shouldn't have gone in to begin with, but I do think that everyone can probably agree that after the fact, what happened after and just killing Gaddafi and leaving wasn't the right plan to take. And to illustrate, though, that they always kind of intended to lead from behind. In the third round of debates, when President Obama was debating, obviously, then Mitt Romney, he talked about this, and he said, when he was talking about how Mitt Romney had said that they should pull out before he killed him, he said, imagine if we pulled out at that point, that Muammar Gaddafi had more American blood on his hands than any individual other than Osama bin Laden. And so we were going to make sure that we finished the job. To them, the job was just killing Gaddafi and then leaving, and that never could be it. It had to be something beyond that. If you're going to go in, you couldn't just say, we're just going to kill him, just that one guy, and we're going to hop out and it's going to be fine.
This is like a lesson in foreign policy, I feel. I feel like what President Obama wanted to do, he wanted us to helicopter on in, do something that would make us feel better about ourselves, honestly, and then helicopter on out and we'd feel good about ourselves, and we left them in total chaos. And I think what this tells us is that when it comes to foreign policy, if we're going to intervene in another country, we have to ask ourselves in advance, are we willing to devote our troops, money, and resources, and deal with
time,
the unique institutions, the culture, all of that? Are we willing to deal with that till the end? And if that answer is no, we don't get to get involved.
And well, the Obama administration...
But they had two failures to point to, examples before that, Afghanistan and Iraq. So they should have known better than to think that Libya was just going to be some kind of a couple-week deal and everything's going to be fine.
The lesson that they may have taken from that is somewhat different, though, which is that we'll intervene, we just will assume afterwards that everything will be okay, because the stabilization afterwards and the reconstruction, that's where you really get burned. Well, what you see here is that a failed state that becomes a haven for al-Qaeda, that's also a really bad situation. David, where do you think this is going, by the way? It seems to me that, at best, maybe it calms down for a bit, but Obama will help have bequeathed essentially to his successor, whoever the president is, a failed state and maybe a safe haven for terrorism. What do you think in Libya?
Unless there's a major terrorist attack that originates in Libya and affects U.S. interests, I don't think we're going to do a whole lot about it. I think that at most the U.S., if there's any sort of government we can help, will provide sort of advise and assist missions, maybe provide aerial surveillance as it fights against militants. But right now I don't think there's even anybody we could offer that kind of assistance to, frankly.
Well, Americans have already died there. I mean, that you can add that to the legacy of Libya.
Well, now we're leading from the way, way, way behind. David, thank you very much. We appreciate your insight. Always good to see you.
My pleasure.